of such a stifling underdrawing. One of the things I've tried to focus on is imagining that I'm sitting behind a camera and I'm the director of each individual sketch. And as the quote-unquote director, I have to figure out where exactly my camera is in relation to the character. The image produced by camera A is going to be drastically different than that of camera C. So let's take a step back from drawing figures and just try to understand the dynamics of planes as they shift in perspective. So if we take a square plane and position it very close to the horizon or eye line, about smart. You've probably seen me refer to this posing maquette several times throughout the channel. It's a really useful tool for figuring out how to place your characters in perspective. But what do we do when we want to sketch a character in perspective without the use of such a stifling underdrawing? One of the things I've tried to focus on is imagining that I'm sitting behind a camera and I'm the director of each individual sketch. And as the quote-unquote director, I have to figure out where exactly my camera is in relation to the character. The image produced by camera A is going to be drastically different than that of camera C. So let's take a step back from drawing figures and just try to understand the dynamics of planes as they shift in perspective. So if we take a square plane and position it very close to the horizon or eye line, the lines leading back to that central vanishing point converge very fast, and the two-dimensional shape actually appears much more like a trapezoid. The lower in our visual field that we bring this plane, the more parallel these lines converging to that central vanishing point appear, and the more square the actual two-dimensional shape appears. This yellow circle represents the visual field when the camera is staring straight ahead, and then as we tilt it down, those parallel lines become increasingly parallel. If instead of a flat square plane we use a cube, what you'll see happen is that our front plane will initially appear as a perfect square, and as it lowers in our visual field, our vertical lines will start to converge together, and it will appear more trapezoidal in shape. Conversely, the top plane, which is converging to a vanishing point on the horizon line, becomes more square as it lowers in our visual field. Now, before we start jumping into figures, it's important to analyze how curves are going to distort in perspective as well. Just as the degree of ellipses and curves change depending on their position in the horizon and orientation to the viewer, the curves of the body are going to undergo the same transformation. So, for example, the one that I use with my students all the time is the eyebrow. When a person is standing directly in front of you, the eyebrow appears to curve upwards. But if we position the person far below the camera, what we'd see is that their brow would actually curve directly downward. And you probably already understand this intuitively. Imagine that you take a cup and you place it directly in front of you. What you notice is that the top edge appears completely flat. But then as you take the cup and lower it down towards your feet, that top plane appears increasingly circular. So getting back to our initial setup, we'll start by drawing the character with the camera positioned directly above looking down. What you'll see is that, as I mentioned, the eyebrows and brow are going to curve directly down. The nose is going to overlap the cheeks and mouth. And the head is going to overlap the shoulders. And just like a cylinder placed far below the horizon line, all of my curves have a very wide degree and appear very circular. And it's under these circumstances that we're going to get the greatest degree of foreshortening. In other words, whenever the camera is positioned directly above looking down or directly below looking up, the figure appears the shortest it could possibly appear. Now as we lower the camera down to position B, what we're going to see is that those curves will start to trend upwards just a little bit more, will expose a bit more of the face, and the foreshortening will be less dramatic. Notice that in A, the head was completely in line with the shoulders, but now in B, the head pokes above and breaks the silhouette.
Yeah. Hi, baby.
Dad, you home?
No, I'm not at home. I'm at the show.
Nah, itu dia. Angle. Sudut pandang.
But again, since we're still above looking down, there will be some foreshortening and overlap of the jacket onto the shoes below.
Siapa yang pengen bisa gambar
Now as we position our camera at location C, everything appears as though it would if we were staring directly out in front of us. The figure is no longer foreshortened, so it appears at its normal length, and all of the curves are restored to their natural state. As I mentioned earlier, the eyebrows are curving somewhat upwards, unlike the previous two examples where they sloped downward. Drawing in a cube for reference of the perspective really demonstrates the same effects occurring as we saw earlier with our forms. In this top-down view, those vertical lines on the front plane converge really fast, and we see just a small sliver of that front. And because the top plane is so far below the horizon, it appears perfectly parallel, and we see the true shape of that plane, just as we're seeing on the top of the head. Position B is that halfway point between the top-down view in A and eye level at C. And now, once again at eye level, that top plane is obscured by the front plane, which on the figure means that we can't see the top of the head. And every curve and form that lies below the horizon line will have an upward slope back to that central vanishing point. Now, another way that we can introduce a dynamic perspective is by changing the lens length. By using a lens that has a shorter focal length or a wider angle, we can capture the entirety of a figure while positioning the camera much closer to them. Because the difference in the angle of light is going to appear drastically different the closer you are to an object, the wide-angle lens has this tendency to produce a very dramatic-looking effect. So you can see that the further you bring the camera away from the figure, the angle that light has to travel to reach the lens becomes closer and closer. The practical effect of this is that as we use a wide-angle lens, all of our vertical lines are going to be somewhat curved. Everything that's above the horizon line is going to curve upward more and more, and likewise everything that's below is going to curve downward at a more extreme rate. So I'll sketch this first figure near a profile view with a wide-angle lens. If we use vanishing lines that go from repeated elements like the shoulders, the hip bones, and the feet, you'll see that there's a great deal of convergence going back to that vanishing point on the right. Elements that are the furthest away from the horizon line, like the feet, show the greatest difference in their position. If we pivot our character so that we're seeing them in a front view, all the lines that are going to the sides are going to appear perfectly horizontal, even if we're using a wide-angle lens. So in this instance, when you draw vanishing lines from shoulder to shoulder and from hip bone to hip bone, they're just going to appear as horizontal lines. However, if you were to simplify the appendages of the body into cylinders, you'd see that the legs, which rest below the horizon line, have a very wide degree, and would appear as though we're looking down at them. Everything on the face curves upwards more than usual because we're looking from beneath the chin up. So you're seeing the underside of the nose and jaw, and those eyebrows tend to curve upward a bit more. One of the other effects of a wide-angle lens is that it dilates the proportions of elements that are close to it. This is particularly notable if you're bringing the wide-angle lens to eye level. The three-point perspective created by the lens means that everything that's below eye level appears smaller and smaller.
Wah, ini sudah expert nih. Gambarnya. Sketnya, kerangkanya udah ada di kepala.
Now we're seeing only the top plane of the feet, and the distance between the two is a lot larger than it was before. As we pivot the character to a near-profile view, we can see the distance in symmetrical elements becomes the most dramatic. The eyes, since they're at the horizon line, appear horizontal from one another. But the angle between the feet is vertical since they're so far below the horizon line. And then once again, if we pivot the character so we're seeing them in a front view, symmetrical elements are going to be horizontally across, no matter what lens we're using.
garis-garisnya sangat efektif semua ya. Efisien.
And you can see that all of the circular wrapping lines on the legs have a really wide degree since they're so far below the horizon line. As I'm showing here, I'll occasionally draw in a reference block that I'll use before starting my sketch. Alright, so if you made it this far, thank you so much for sticking it through to the end. If any of these topics were confusing, be sure to check out some of my other videos on perspective, as well as some of my other videos on drawing characters and dynamic poses. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe, and consider supporting the channel on Patreon. We have many great options, from discounted prices on future Gumroads, group lessons, and what.
Oke, video tadi layak untuk dijadikan referensi. Istilahnya dia membandingkan sisi tampilan angle yang digambar itu dengan sisi dari box atau kotak. Mungkin bagi yang bisa membayangkannya akan langsung dapat memahami juga, tapi bagi yang belum mungkin agak butuh waktu sejenak. Itu hanya satu tampilan atau penampakan kotak yang dipengaruhi oleh perspektif, angle-nya sedemikian rupa, kemudian diterapkan pada menggambar figur orang. Kita lihat tadi si artis tadi benar-benar sangat skillnya sangat dapat diandalkan tanpa harus sketching terlebih dulu, ancang-ancang, ini semuanya sudah ada di kepala dia tinggal mencurahkan, menuangkan bentuknya ke panel kanvas. Ya, saya yakin semua teman-teman pada pengen bisa menggambar seperti itu ya. Semoga ada kesempatan ke sana. Kemudian satu lagi, ini masih ada satu lagi mengenai shortening, tidak sepanjang tadi, ini lebih pendek. Nah, silakan menikmati.
In this video, we'll take a look at foreshortening, or drawing the figure in perspective. There is an endless number of ways that you can draw the human figure. For myself, I like to take a 4-step approach. I'll draw a line from the top of the head to the bottom of the feet. This will help to ensure that I get the entire figure on the picture plane. From there, I'll locate a line for the shoulders and a line for the waist. Once I have these important lines in place, I can then look at the bone structure of the figure. I usually draw lines to indicate each longer bone within the body. Essentially, I'm creating a loose stick figure. I'll also include an oval shape for the head. With these essential lines in place, I can then build off of them to create the shapes that make up the form of the body. I can also add information about the clothing. Because our initial lines establish the overall proportion of the figure, we can concentrate on the contour lines that we actually observe on the subject at this point, making drawing the figure a whole lot easier. Now, of course, this method works great when your figure is from a straight-on view, but what happens when your figure is in perspective? When the angles are a little bit more challenging. This is referred to as foreshortening. Whenever you draw the figure in perspective, we have a foreshortened view of many of the body parts. Of course, when we're drawing a figure that's foreshortened, the challenge goes way up. But if we pay attention to a couple of key elements, we can make things quite a bit easier on ourselves. The first thing we'll look for is the length of line used to describe different elements. Take a look at how long the line is for the figure standing from a straight-on view and how much it's compressed when we draw the figure from above. This means all of the other body parts are going to be compressed, creating quite a bit of distortion. We can clearly see this distortion when we compare the length of line used for the head from the straight-on view and compare it to the length of line used to describe the head from above. Because in this case the head is closer to the viewer, the head is much larger. Another example of distortion that's happening here is the length of line used to describe the leg. Notice how long the line is when the figure is on a straight-on view and how short it becomes when we draw the figure from above in perspective. Notice how foreshortening affects the length of nearly every single body part when we draw the figure in perspective. Now, here again, once we've got the basic elements in place and we've made comparisons between the length of line and we understand the distortion that takes place, we can easily draw in the rest of the details of our figure. Now, this same phenomenon happens, of course, when we're drawing a figure that's lying down. Remember, any body part that comes towards the viewer is going to create some distortion and is also going to affect the length of line that we use to describe it. Now, since handling foreshortening can be quite a big challenge, it might be easier to think about each body part as being a geometric form. Take, for example, this cylinder. If we were to draw cross-contour lines over the contours of the form of the cylinder, we notice that these lines curve slightly. We can think about each section or each body part of the figure as being a geometric form. For example, we can lay this cylinder down and make it appear as if it's going back in space. Here we can draw the cross-contour lines over and allow those lines to curve as they go backwards into space. Maybe we'll draw a sphere for a joint, and then we'll draw an additional cylinder. Notice how these cross-contour lines continue to curve around the form of the cylinder. If we were to translate this concept into the actual body parts of a figure, like the upper portion and lower portion of an arm and a hand of a figure, we can actually draw the cross-contour lines over this to have a better understanding of the form of the subject. This is just, of course, to help us better understand the form of the subject. These cross-contour lines, of course, aren't actually visible on the subject, but we can apply this concept when we draw the figure to better understand how the form behaves in space. Some people like to think of these lines as being coils that recede back in space, something like you would see on a slinky. So when we draw the actual form of the lower portion of the legs that are quite foreshortened, we might decide to draw the cross-contour lines so we can better understand how these legs recede backwards into space. And of course, we'll continue to keep in mind that the length of line used for individual body parts will more than likely shrink because of the foreshortening. We'll also consider the fact that distortion is at play. And in this case, the length of line for the foot is much longer because the foot is closer to the viewer. Once we've made these comparisons and we've got our important information on the surface of the paper, then it's very easy to go back in and fill in the additional information needed to complete the drawing, like the contour lines and the shapes for the individual parts of the body. So let's review. When we're dealing with a figure in perspective, this is referred to as foreshortening. And with foreshortening, you'll notice that certain elements become much shorter depending on the point of view. We'll also be dealing with distortion, where some of the elements will be much larger depending again on the point of view. Drawing the figure in perspective or foreshortening can be challenging, but when you know what to look for and you know how to apply it to your drawings, it's much, much easier.
Nah, oke, bagaimana teman-teman semuanya? Sudah clear bukan? Clear dalam artian bisa memahami terlebih dulu, tidak masalah. Nanti dalam latihan itu adalah bukti pemahaman yang tampil dalam satu atau sebuah gambar Ada yang mau disampaikan? Yang video pertama tadi mengenai menggambar perspektif, di mana letak pemirsa itu menentukan bentuk yang akan terjadi. Tadi diwakili oleh satu figur berjaket, satu figur pria berjaket, tetapi digambar dari berbagai angle, bahkan dari angle yang ekstrim sekalipun. Angle dari kameranya dari frontal, dari bawah, dan misalnya menghadap ke atas. Ada kan tadi kan? Nah, berikutnya juga angle-angle yang lebih ke tengah lagi, lurus ke area badan, tadi diberi nama ABCD, sampai ekstrim juga di atas kepala, agak lurus. Dan hasilnya adalah yang sudah sebagaimana kalian saksikan tadi. Kemudian di video yang kedua, nah satu penerangan, penjelasan yang lebih tuntas lagi mengenai foreshortening, yaitu gejala yang terjadi akibat sudut pandang tadi. Terutama sudut pandang yang ekstrim akan menghasilkan beberapa bagian tubuh yang dilihat oleh pemirsa tampak mengalami apa coba tadi kata yang lain tadi. Apa yo? Siapa yang nyimak?
Distraction, Pak.
Distortion, betul Mas Seriantoko, betul. Jadi distorsi itu adalah perubahan bentuk. Distort, ada fasilitas distort di Photoshop. Nah, di menceng-menceng, ditarik, dikendurkan, pokoknya seperti itu, mengalami bentuk yang aneh, perubahan bentuk karena gara-gara sudut pandang yang ekstrim tadi. Secara sangat sederhana diperbandingkan sebentar. Secara sederhana diperbandingkan ukuran normal. Anggap yang paling kiri itu adalah bentuk normal. Ukuran normal dengan ukuran terdistorsinya, di mana diwakili oleh mungkin tadi kepala ya. Kepala yang cuma pendeknya segini, terdistorsi, mengalami foreshortening, jadi berlipat 2, bahkan lebih. Kemudian juga tadi bagian sejak dari pangkal paha sampai kaki yang panjangnya segini, di sini terdistorsi hanya menjadi susut sepertiganya mungkin. Nah itu hal-hal keep it simple stupid secara sederhana, tapi itu terjadi gejalanya. Kemudian telapak tadi juga dibandingkan. Di sini jadi panjang. Karena tadi ada kata-kata juga, letak kamera yang dekat dengan objek tersebut, maka terjadilah foreshortening, di mana intinya terjadi perubahan bentuk, entah bertambah, menyusut, terdistorsi menjadi baru yang kalau dicermati itu agak-agak aneh. Akan tetapi itulah bentuk figur yang benar-benar diterapkan perspektif secara ekstrim. Terus muncul, seperti itu muncul. Contoh paling dekat, kalau kalian punya cermin sekarang nih, di meja kalian masing-masing mungkin, ya silahkan atur jarak sedemikian rupa, kepalkan tangan, sodorkan ke cermin, lihat kepalan tangan Anda seberapa besar dari kepala kalian. Kalau enggak minimal sama, bahkan kepala kalian lebih kecil dari kepalan tangan yang dekat di cermin itu tadi. Nah, itu contoh paling real. Oh ya, dan kemudian perhatikan lengan kalian. Lengan kalian yang panjangnya segitu, ada lengan atas siku, kemudian lengan bawah. Seolah-olah menjadi memendek. Kayak antena diselisipin gitu. Antena bisa memanjang memendek. Nah, dilihat dari sudut pandang yang ekstrim. Itu udah real. Tidak bisa dibantah. Contoh paling real dari distorsi yang terjadi akibat atau sebagai bawaan dari gejala foreshortening. Banyak sekali contoh-contoh foreshortening. Jika kalian suka dengan komik, ya terus baca itu, cermati panel-panel komiknya, pasti akan muncul tuh distorsi atau foreshortening di sana sini. Juga di film-film juga tetap 1-2 kali, mungkin karena cepat ya kalau film ya gerakannya, tapi foreshortening juga kemungkinan besar akan tampak. Ini presensi manual, jangan lupa, sudah diingatkan Mas Bramdhani. Presensi QR juga jangan lupa. Nah, jadi materinya memang itu. Mungkin besok mungkin ada satu case yang bisa kalian cermati. Satu aman saja ini. Silahkan lihat, saya sharing di WA di WhatsApp.